Okay, so today is Monday, March 27th, 2023, right before 1 o'clock p.m. And today I am finally going to begin my video series in the book of Psalms. I finished up the Old Testament narrative a month ago, maybe? I don't know the exact day. It's been a while. And I've been preparing now for this Psalms video series. But once I get through Psalms, I'll be done with the Old Testament. And at that time, I'll probably be taking a break from doing these videos so that I can upload. I stopped uploading my videos last May, so I need to upload a lot of them. And that'll take a while, so I'll need to do that. And then I'm also going to need to refamiliarize myself with the New Testament because I've been so immersed in the Old Testament now for like 3+ years. Since the end of 2019, actually. I've been studying the Old Testament exclusively now for over 3 years, close to 3.5 years. So I'm not really in the best position at this point to begin teaching or lecturing on the New Testament like I may have been a few years ago. I don't consider my New Testament familiarity to be up to snuff, so I'll need to spend some time kind of reading it and get myself used to it again. So I'm not going to be moving around the New Testament right away after getting done with Psalms, but I will eventually. At any rate, now we're working on Psalms. Now, for the most part, once I get started reading the Psalms, I'm just going to read them. I'm not going to be doing a lot of teaching or explaining or instructing as I actually read them. I'm just going to be reading them. Maybe a little commentary here and there, but I don't really anticipate doing a lot of that. However, I am going to do a video or two here to introduce the Psalms, because there are some things I can teach about the Psalms that will help us as we actually read through the Psalms. Okay, so the Psalms are songs, hymns, prayers of Israel. I saved this book for last. I'm doing this last. I've already done all the Old Testament except for the Psalms. And as I was doing it the last 2 years, I've been doing the video series now for 2 years. I've been reading through the Old Testament for over 3 years. I started doing the videos right about this time of the year in March of 2021. But I began reading through the Old Testament at the end of 2019. And began my deep dive into the Old Testament even 1.5 years before I started doing the videos on it. But I saved this for last. Partially, for a few different reasons. For one thing, the Psalms don't really fit easily into the chronology because we don't know when each individual Psalm was written. It's called Psalms. That's actually its Greek name. Its Hebrew name, I think, stands for praise. But there's 150 separate entities in this collection. It's a collection of songs. And so each individual song had to come from somewhere, by someone, at some point in time. And that happened all throughout Israel's history, and we have no way of establishing when some of that happened. So it's really impossible to fit them in chronologically. Now, I did read a couple of the songs that are attached to David, as I read through David's life. I did do that. But for the most part, I didn't, except for a couple. And I think maybe one by Solomon, maybe I did. But I didn't do that. And honestly, the Psalms are not really meant to be read that way anyway. The Psalms are not really meant to be fitted into the chronological context the way, some of the other material in the Old Testament might benefit from. I mean, in general, the Old Testament is not really all that concerned with chronology. In general, the Bible is not all that concerned with chronology. That's more of a modern Western, desire to have everything lined up neatly in a row. The original writers of the Bible were not that. So it's not like it didn't matter to them at all, which, I mentioned this before many times, but it wasn't very high on their list of priorities. It was on there, but it wasn't very high up on the list. And the Psalms in particular, it's just except for a few that are attached to specific incidents in David's life, there's really... So they come from all time. We have one from Moses, we have a bunch from David. About half of them have David's name attached to them. Moses lived in around 1500 BC. The Exodus happened in 1446 or so BC. David lived around 1000 BC. They came back from exile or in the 500-ish BC time frame. And these Psalms were written, so about 1,000 years. So from the beginning of the written part of the Bible to the end, from the beginning of the works of Moses to Ezra and Nehemiah, which we read, finished last time, about 1,000 years take place. And the Psalms were written and produced kind of throughout that time period. And David himself happens to fall in pretty much right in the middle of that time frame. And most of the Psalms have, well, I shouldn't say most, but about half the Psalms have his name attached to them. It's impossible to say for certain whether he actually authored those Psalms or whether they just have his name attached to them. But we'll identify him as basically the source, or at least the inspiration for the Psalms. He was a songwriter. He was a music guy. I mean, we read about that plenty in his part of the Old Testament narrative in Samuel and Chronicles, that he was a music guy. He played the harp, he played the lyre, he sang songs. A couple of the Psalms actually are on his mouth in the book of Samuel as he sings them. So he definitely produced a lot of these songs. He established a temple worship system. He did not build a temple. He wanted to. He didn't. He established a temple worship system and created this division of music they were going to follow when they built the temple after his death. And that basically became what we call now the Psalms, or the Psalm book, or the Psalter. And so he is very much identified with the Psalms. The Psalms speak to a lot of his concerns. They speak to the royal line of David. They're very kingly focused. They're very much focused on presenting the reign of God over Israel and the entire world, which is what David was concerned about. They focus a lot on God's special promise to David to have a man on his throne forever, which of course culminates in Jesus Christ. And so there is a big kingly focus in the Psalms. David is strongly attached to the Psalms. His name is attached to almost half the Psalms. And whether or not we can prove that David technically wrote all of those, really honestly doesn't matter. But they come from different periods of time. And even in David's life, they came from different periods of time. So there was no sense in reading them chronologically. The Psalms as a book, as a unit, as a collection, were almost certainly, in my opinion at least, were almost certainly the last book of the Old Testament to be finalized. So last time we finished reading Ezra and Nehemiah, and that was the last historical book to take place. And that would have been completed by either Ezra himself or maybe the student or disciple of his sometime in the late 400s BC. And the Psalms, as a unit, as a collection, as a book, as a finished thing, would not have been finished any earlier than that, and quite likely would have been finished later than that. The Psalms were definitely edited, so even if the names attached to the Psalms do reflect the accuracy of the original author, the books have clearly been edited. The Psalms have been rearranged, definitely multiple times throughout history. And the final version of the Psalm book almost certainly doesn't come isn't any more recent than 400 BC, which is around the time Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles would have been written, and probably even after that. So it makes sense even in that regard to read this book last, because as a finished unit, it would have been put together basically last of all the Old Testament books. Also, we don't know, in the Bible itself, you don't really get any indication of how Israel actually used the Psalms. Just almost none. Now, the New Testament does quote from the Psalms a lot, so the New Testament writers and Jesus himself were very well familiar with the Psalms, and it's important, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But as far as, understanding like how they actually used and interacted with the Psalms, if you just read the Bible itself, you get almost no information on that. They just kind of appear in the middle of your Old Testaments as a collection of songs. And in the Bible, you get almost very, very little insight into how they actually used these songs or sung them or interacted with them. Clearly, though, they did. Now, we don't know very much about how they were used in the First Temple period. Like when, David, of course, even lived before the Temple, or Solomon, okay. It seems to me that David wrote a whole bunch of songs and left them behind as a sort of hymnal for the Israelites to use in the temple worship service after they finished the temple, which was not going to happen until after David himself had died. So to help, he prepared a lot of the building plans. He tried to get he prepared a lot of the building materials We know about this. The Chronicles, it goes into great detail about this. And he also set up their worship system, and probably that included writing a bunch of songs as a sort of hymn book for them. He established Asaph and other guys as like the leaders of the Temple of Music, and some of their names, some of the songs are attached to those guys' names. So probably David originally left them with a collection of songs, either written by him or written by his musicians, to be added to the book, to be used in their temple worship service after he had died in the days of Solomon and following. And that probably, and most of that probably is seen in the early part of the song book as we have it right now, the beginning of like the first half of the Psalms. Most of that probably would have been like the original song book as it existed in David's day or just after, to whatever degree that we can determine at least. But it was clearly edited and added to, and songs were moved around and reshuffled and refocused, and editorial notes were added and things like that. And that was going on at least until after they returned from exile, and probably down until not long before they started translating the Old Testament into Greek, which started happening in the mid-200s BC. And the Psalms were one of the first things that they focused on translating after the books of Moses. In terms of how they used it in the Second Temple period, so we don't really know. The First Temple period is too far back in time and too mysterious, and we really don't know much about how they would have actually used the Psalms then. Again, but honestly, that isn't really all that important today anyway, because what really matters is how they used it in the Second Temple period, because that is the environment in which Jesus and the apostles would have lived. When we get to the New Testament, we're going to be reading the works of people, Jesus himself as the person they're writing about, and then the authors as the first people writing, except for Luke, who was not a Jew. These men were completely familiar with the temple environment that existed at the beginning of the first century AD, and into the beginning of the church era, throughout Christ's ministry, in the beginning of the church era. They were familiar with the temple system. They were familiar with all the Psalms. They quoted them extensively in the New Testament, and they applied them to Jesus. And so we need to understand the Psalms today in the way the New Testament writers did, the way Jesus did. So it really doesn't matter too much how the Psalms were used in the First Temple period. That's a matter of historical curiosity. But in terms of how it applies to us today, it's really not that relevant. What we need to focus on and understand is how Jesus and the apostles understood the Psalms, because that's how we need to understand the Psalms. And like I said, we don't really get any indication in the Bible itself of how they actually used the Psalms. We know they did a lot because they quote them so much. From other Jewish writings of that time period, we know a few things. Okay, I mean, in the Old Testament itself, we read about the worship singers and the temple musicians and stuff. And even in the Psalms, you have these headings attached to each psalm that sometimes give instructions of how they're meant to be used in the temple worship, like to the choir director according to a certain melody or a certain type of instrument or whatever. So they were definitely meant to be sung publicly by the temple personnel. And remember, in the temple, they had an entire division of Levites who were the musicians. They were the musical class. They played the instruments, they sang the songs. Some of them even have written songs. That's where the songs of Asaph come from, because Asaph was one of those first guys that David appointed at the beginning. And so there was like an entire class of professional worshipers. Now, we don't really have anything like that today. We might have like choirs in some of our churches today. The temple system called for a permanent class of professional worshipers. From what I can tell, and this is just my trying to kind of visually, or trying to imagine how this would have actually functioned, how it would have looked and how it would have functioned back at that time. From what I can tell, it seems like they had pretty much a permanent ongoing choir that sang all the time. Now, obviously, no human being can continuously sing without needing a break. Now, in heaven, they do this, okay? And some of the few glimpses of heaven at the throne of God that we get in Scripture, like at Revelation at the end, we do see these tireless angelic beings that never stop singing out and shouting praises to God, and they do it constantly all the time without a break. Human beings can't do that. finite, limited, fallen, fallible human beings, mortal, physical human beings, have bodies that wear out, vocal cords that wear out. We can't do that. Ancient Israelites couldn't do that either. So it seems like to me, again, this is just my visualization of what I read when I read the Old Testament description of this, is that you had pretty much a permanent class of professional musicians that were always, and there was always some form of choir going on in the temple somewhere. You know, they had these lights. They were always had to keep. You know, the priests had to keep these certain lamps and certain altars always burning, always aflame. You know, if the light ever went out, that was a bad thing. In heaven, we have this constant, ongoing vocal worship of God, always, never ceasing, always going on. And I believe that in the temple, the choir was always singing somewhere. And of course, no individual person was ever going to be able to do that, so they would have had to rotate in and out frequently throughout the day. But I believe that they would have, I believe that somewhere in the temple there would have always been a choir singing. At least they're supposed to be. Now, whether or not that actually operated that way, but it seems like that was the idea. It seems like there was always supposed to be constant, ongoing singing to God going on in the temple. However, so there was a professional class of worshipers that sang, and I don't know exactly. There's 150 songs, okay, and so I don't know exactly how they rotated amongst them. Now we do have some insight from other Jewish sources, not the Old Testament, not the New Testament either. You know, from how the temple functioned. They had certain songs that they sang on certain days, like the days of the week had songs attached to them. I forget now what numbers those songs were. Like our Sunday would have had a song that went with it that they would have sung, and then all the way down to the end of the week. And then their feast days had certain songs. Later in the book of Psalms, we'll get to a category of songs called the Songs of Ascents, which apparently they sang as they were going to Jerusalem for the feast days, or maybe the pilgrims would have sung those when they were going to Jerusalem just any time. So they had like certain songs that did fit certain occasions. They may have had like a lexicon, so to speak, to use today's terminology, that they rotated where they sang certain, they just kind of sang the songs in order. I'm not sure. I don't think that the public was forbidden from singing the psalms. I don't think so. I think they could. Okay, I think as a worshiper going to the temple, I think you could sing. I think the Levites had to. I think there was a professional class of musicians that had to sing. And I think they sang all the time. Like I said, I think there was always singing going on. I don't think the worshipers, the public, were forbidden from it, though. I mean, at the end of the book of Psalms, we have these series of psalms that just tell everybody to just praise the Lord all the time. So I don't think they were forbidden. I think they were definitely encouraged and exhorted to do so. I don't know how they would have done it. I don't know really how the worshipers themselves would have sung these songs. I guess maybe they would have sung in response to the worship leaders, the choir directors. I don't really know. But they would have had these songs memorized, okay? And honestly, it's not really all that difficult. I mean, today, there's 150 songs in this book, and they're all pretty short. I mean, even the longest one, of course, is Psalm 119, which is pretty long. But these songs are basically pretty short. We have even I, and I'm not a music guy, but even I have plenty of songs that I have in my memory banks that I could probably recite to you word for word or close to word for word right now. I don't know if I could have 150, but even without trying, just as I've lived, I've heard enough songs. There are some songs I've just heard enough that I have those songs basically memorized. So if you're in a culture where memory was more important than it is today, their memories are better than our memories because they had to memorize more than we have to memorize, so they use them more. It wouldn't have been difficult for you to memorize these songs, especially if you were taught them growing up and if you were fully immersed in them. So they would have had these songs it's just constantly in their database, in their memory banks, on their lips, on their tongues. Again, there was a professional class of worshipers that sang the songs constantly, unendingly, I believe, in the temple, but the people themselves out in the villages and their towns, I think, could have sung these songs pretty much whenever they wanted to. like I said, the certain psalms were used on certain days, or for certain events, or for certain festivals, for certain commemorations. I'm guessing there probably would have been like a regular order where they would have gone through the whole book in some form or fashion, but I honestly don't know how they would have done that. Okay, so that is, now this is getting to be kind of long. I'm not near done with my intro, so I'll be doing another video. But that is in terms of like how the Psalms were probably used in terms of like who was singing them and how and when and in what circumstances.